Most people avoid wallpaper because they think it's risky, overwhelming, and easy to mess up. And that fear makes sense, because when wallpaper goes wrong, it can make a room feel loud, dated, and just uncomfortable to be in. But in this video, I'm going to show you why that assumption is holding your home back. Because you can make any room look twice as good just by using wallpaper, and that's without changing the layout, replacing furniture, or committing to an expensive renovation. And if you follow the 5-step framework I'm about to share with you, I promise wallpaper will stop feeling intimidating and start feeling easy. You'll know exactly when to use it, how much to use, and how to make it work using simple decisions that are far easier and safer than most people think. But to understand why this framework works, you need to understand how wallpaper actually impacts a room. And the easiest way to think about it is like getting dressed. Imagine someone wearing a really bold jacket. Strong color, heavy texture, and a lot of presence. That jacket can look incredible if everything else is simple. If it's paired with a neutral shirt, pants, and shoes, and nothing is competing with it for attention, then the jacket becomes the sole focal point, and the outfit works. But now imagine a colorful jacket paired with loud pants, chunky accessories, and a busy shirt underneath. Now, the whole outfit collapses and you end up looking like a clown. Not because any individual piece is bad, but because there's no order. And wallpaper works the exact same way, because most people make one of two mistakes with wallpaper. On one end, they're too cautious. They choose tiny, quiet patterns because they feel safe. But once those patterns go on the wall, they just turn into visual noise. They're busy up close and invisible from a distance. And then on the other end, people go all in. Every wall wrapped, bold patterns everywhere, with furniture and accessories all fighting for your attention. And it might look dramatic in a photo, but in real life, it just feels exhausting. But good wallpaper lives in the middle. And most people miss this because they think wallpaper is about pattern, when it's actually about control. Control over where it goes, how much of it you use, and how it relates to everything else in the room. So instead of giving you random wallpaper ideas or telling you which patterns are in, I want to give you a framework, a way to look at any room and know whether wallpaper should be there at all, and if it should, exactly how to use it so it feels intentional instead of overwhelming. And that framework is called paper. And each letter solves one of the core wallpaper mistakes that people make. And once you start seeing things through the lens of the paper framework, wallpaper stops feeling like a gamble and starts feeling like a design tool. So let's start at the beginning, because if you get this part wrong, nothing else will work. The first P in paper stands for purpose. And this is where most wallpaper goes wrong. Because wallpaper isn't something designers add just to make a room more interesting. They use it to give a wall a job, to anchor something important, to define a zone, to add visual weight where the architecture is weak, or to create a focal point when the room is missing one. But when wallpaper doesn't have a clear purpose, it almost always makes the space worse instead of better. And this is why wallpaper so often feels random. People choose a pattern they like, and then they try to figure out where in their home to put it. But designers work in the opposite direction. They start by asking what the room is missing. Does the bed feel like it's floating? Does the dining table lack definition? Is there a long blank wall with no visual gravity? Wallpaper is a tool to solve those problems, not a finishing touch that you sprinkle on top. And so a useful way to think about it is this. If the room already works without wallpaper, adding it will usually hurt the space, because wallpaper is strongest when it's doing heavy lifting, when it's anchoring a bedroom, grounding a dining area, or giving presence to a space that feels weak or empty. So if you can't clearly explain what your wallpaper is doing for your room, it's probably not needed. And this is why feature walls fail so often. The issue isn't the idea of highlighting a wall, it's highlighting the wrong wall. Because purpose always needs to come first. Once the wallpaper has a clear role, everything else in the room has something to respond to. And that's when wallpaper stops feeling risky and starts delivering rewards. Now, the A in paper stands for amount. And this is where most wallpaper decisions swing too far in one direction. Because as I said a second ago, most people believe that wallpaper is all or nothing. Either every wall is covered, or wallpaper doesn't get used at all. But designers almost never think this way, and in most homes, partial coverage looks far more deliberate than wrapping an entire room. And that's mostly because wallpaper can be visually intense, and once it's on the wall, it immediately becomes one of the strongest elements in the space. So covering every surface often overwhelms the room, especially in open or larger areas where the pattern just has nowhere to rest. But on the other hand, if you just opt to put wallpaper on one well-chosen wall, it gives the wallpaper a clear presence without allowing it to take over. And this is why designers often use wallpaper in controlled zones, the back of built-ins, a dining nook, or a little recessed niche, because these moments let wallpaper feel purposeful and contained instead of loud or chaotic. But of course, wallpapering an entire room isn't wrong, but it is more rare than you'd think, because wallpaper often works best in small, enclosed spaces where the intensity feels deliberate, places like powder rooms, small studies, or narrow hallways, because in those cases, the room becomes the wallpaper. But in most other spaces, you're going to want to lean more into restraint. Now, the second P in paper stands for pattern scale, and this is one of the most misunderstood parts of wallpaper, because most people default to small patterns because they feel safer. Tiny repeats seem subtle on a sample, so they feel like a low-risk choice. But once those patterns go on a wall, they usually do the opposite of what people expect. Instead of feeling calm, they turn into visual noise, because small patterns demand attention everywhere. They repeat constantly, give your eye nowhere to rest, and they can make a room feel busy and restless over time. So designers almost always size up, not down, because larger patterns feel like a single gesture from across the room, and you don't see every detail at once, you read the pattern as a whole. And that's why large-scale wallpaper often feels calmer and more confident, even when the design itself is still bold. And pattern scale also affects how expensive wallpaper feels, because big patterns feel intentional. They look like they were designed for the wall they sit on. But small patterns often feel like fabric or wrapping paper once they're blown up to a big scale, which is why they can make a room feel dated. So if the pattern still makes sense from across the room, the scale is probably right. But if it only works when you're standing close to the wall, and it's probably too small for your space. Now, the E in paper stands for environment, and this is about matching the wallpaper to how your room actually feels, not just how it looks in a photo, because every room has an energy to it. A bedroom is meant to slow you down, a dining room is meant to be social, and a home office is meant to provide focus. So when your wallpaper feels wrong, it's often because the pattern's energy doesn't match the energy the room is meant to create. And this is one of the areas where a lot of people go wrong with wallpaper. Because a high contrast, aggressive pattern might look amazing online, but in a bedroom, it can feel restless and overwhelming. But at the same time, a softer, quieter pattern can disappear completely in a brighter, more active space, like a dining room or a kitchen nook. And light also plays a huge role here. Low light rooms amplify contrast, so bold patterns can feel heavier than you expect. And brighter rooms can handle more contrast and complexity because the light keeps everything legible. So if a room only gets soft or indirect light, the wallpaper usually needs to be calmer to avoid feeling murky or oppressive. So designers think about wallpaper the same way they think about music. You wouldn't play high energy music in a room meant for resting, and you wouldn't choose something barely audible in a space meant to host a lot of people. And so, the way you choose wallpaper should be the exact same. But when you get it right, and the wallpaper's energy matches its environment, your room instantly feels so much more natural. And the R in paper stands for restraint, and this is the final step for a reason, because this is where most wallpaper mistakes actually happen. Because opting for wallpaper is already a big move. The moment it goes on the wall, it raises the visual volume of the entire room. So once it's in place, your job isn't to keep adding, it's to know when to stop. And a lot of people sense that their room feels off after they install wallpaper, and their instinct is to fix it by layering even more things on top. So more patterns, more art, and more accessories. But that usually makes the problem worse, because the issue isn't that the wallpaper needs competition, It's that nothing else is stepping back. And this is why designers often treat wallpaper as the visual peak of the room. And once that peak is established, everything else needs to get quieter by comparison. Not because minimalism is the goal, but because restraint is what allows the wallpaper to actually work. And this is also how you know when you're done, because a room that uses wallpaper well should feel complete sooner than you expect. But if you keep feeling the urge to add more things to balance things out, it's a sign that you haven't exercised enough restraint. But when you get it right, your wallpaper doesn't overwhelm the space, it anchors it. And instead of feeling busy or chaotic, the room just feels confident, calm, and finished. But now that you understand the thinking behind the paper framework, I want to make it easy to actually use it in your own home. And that's why I took the logic behind paper, along with hundreds of hand-chosen, high-quality wallpaper samples, and built them directly into my custom paper tool. And now all you have to do is upload a photo of your room, and the paper tool shows you how you should use wallpaper in your space, where it makes sense, how much to use, and what kind of pattern fits your room. And it's all based on the principles behind the paper framework, not on guesswork. So instead of randomly picking a wallpaper you like and hoping it works in your space, you can see exactly how wallpaper would look in your room before you commit to it. So before I tell you how you can access the paper tool yourself, let me show you a few examples of how it works so you can see the framework and the tool in action, because it generated all the revised images that you're about to see. So this hallway is a great example of a space that's technically fine, but also completely forgettable. The proportions are good, the symmetry is nice, and the trim work is clean, but because the walls are just white from end to end, nothing is helping guide your eye or give the space a sense of arrival. You just walk through it, and that's it. So this is exactly the kind of space where wallpaper makes sense, because everything else is already calm and controlled. The floor is quiet and the doors are clean, so the room can handle more. Let's see what might work. If you like the light, quiet feeling of the original hallway and you don't want to change that, this is a good place to start. The wallpaper here stays soft and neutral, so it doesn't jump out at you, but what it does do is break up that long stretch of white wall. So the hallway doesn't feel endless anymore, like you're walking toward the light at the end of your life. And the subtle pattern gives your eyes something to move along as you walk through the space. But because the colors stay close to the trim and floor, nothing feels busy or loud. So the hallway is still calm, but now it feels like someone actually thought about this space instead of leaving it empty. And this version takes it a step further by adding in some color, but it still respects the fact that this is a hallway. So the pattern is more noticeable, but it's large enough that it doesn't feel noisy. But what really works here is the contrast with the white trim, because suddenly the wainscoting feels more architectural than it did with the plain white wall. The hallway still feels light and open, but now it's got some personality, like it belongs to this home, not just to any home. But if you're someone who wants to make the hallway a moment of its own, then this darker wallpaper completely changes how the space feels. Instead of emphasizing how long the hallway is, it adds some weight and intimacy. And now it feels more enclosed and more deliberate, almost like a pause between rooms instead of a corridor that you rush through. And the reason this works is because it exercises restraint. The trim stays white, the floor stays simple, and nothing else is trying to compete. So the wallpaper gets to be the main character, and everything else around it becomes a supporting element. But let's move on to another example. This living room here is obviously very minimal. The furniture is low, simple, and neutral, and the room feels pretty calm because nothing is trying too hard. But that also means the walls aren't really doing any work yet. They're just sitting there. So if you want to introduce personality into a space like this, wallpaper is actually one of the cleanest ways to do it because the rest of the room is quiet enough to support it. So if you want to go in a more graphic direction, you could use a wallpaper like this one with these curved geometric shapes. And what works here is that the pattern feels bold, but it's still controlled. The repetition gives the wall a defined structure, and the rounded forms echo the softness of the furniture in the room. And because the colors stay within a warm, earthy range, the wall doesn't completely overpower the room, it just gives it a clear focal point. Now, in this setup, you wouldn't want to introduce loud furniture or strong accent colors because the wallpaper is already carrying that visual weight, but as long as the furniture stays simple, this can totally work. So if you want to go in a more graphic direction, you could use a wallpaper like this one with these curved geometric shapes. The key here is that the colors still connect back to the existing palette of the warm wood, soft neutrals, and subtle contrast, so nothing feels random. And because the pattern is detailed but not aggressive, it adds depth to the wall without immediately demanding all your attention. And so the upside of this approach is flexibility. You can change the seating, swap out textiles, or introduce different materials over time, and the wallpaper will still make sense. Or if you want to go fully expressive, this third option shows how far you can push it when the rest of the room is restrained. This wallpaper has a more Mediterranean feel to it with much brighter colors, but it still works because everything else is calm. So I don't think I would put this in my own living room, but if you've got an indoor-outdoor dining space that you use on summer evenings, this is kind of a cool style that could really work. Now, for this third example, I want to show you what full wall wallpaper actually looks like when it works. Because, like I mentioned earlier, covering every wall is really hard to get right, but when you do nail it, it's usually in small, contained spaces, and this bathroom is a great example of that. So if you want a dark, moody vibe in your bathroom, this first option is a great example of how to do that without making the space feel small or uncomfortable. The deep background color and oversized floral pattern gives the room a sense of depth, almost like the walls fall away instead of closing in. And because everything else stays quiet, with the white fixtures, the simple mirror, and the really minimal accessories, the wallpaper does all the work without the room feeling busy. And it turns a really basic bathroom into something dramatic and memorable, even though nothing about the layout changed. Now, this second option applies the same full wall idea, but pushes it in a lighter direction. The pattern is still bold enough to carry the room, but the softer colors and brighter background keep the space feeling open instead of heavy. And this works especially well if you want personality without committing to a dark palette. The wallpaper adds a bit of movement and life to the walls, while the fixtures stay simple and clean, so the room still feels relaxed. Now, you might hate all of the wallpapers that I've shown you here, and that's totally fine, because these are just some samples that the paper tool created, and there's an infinite number of variations that you can create for your own home. Because the paper tool isn't just pulling from the wallpaper samples I've uploaded, it's actually generating new styles every time you run it. If you're at all curious about whether wallpaper might give your room the upgrade you're looking for, this is something you're going to want to try, and you can get access to it from the link in the description or by visiting 5by9.co. But if you're really serious about improving the look and feel of your home, you're going to need more than just a couple of strips of wallpaper. You need a decision-making system that'll help you get great results in your home, but also prevent you from making the big mistakes that cost most people thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars. So watch this video next to learn that decision-making system and save yourself both the headache and the cost. I'll see you there.